Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Jax Bayne joins us to discuss their intersectionality and how that impacts their autism. We also talk about co-occurring conditions for autistic people and Jax's experience as a support service coordinator. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Jax, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'd love to start our conversation by learning, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Well, I could be silly and be like, birth, ha 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 ha, no, right? Or before that, because of, genetics, no, I don't know. But in terms of when autism appeared on my personal radar, that wasn't until 2012, I would say, when I was 22. And I, at that point, had no formal mental health diagnoses or any diagnoses of any kind, even though I had been struggling with a lot depression, anxiety, all of these things, from a very young age. And it wasn't until I was complaining about body language and nonverbal social cues and how people were expecting me to be a mind reader and somehow just infer or intuit what it is that they meant without saying those explicit words. And I was like complaining to a new friend about this. And he was like, those are autistic traits. And I was like, I'm sorry, what now? So that is when I started to look into what autism actually was. And at the time, it was, being called Asperger's. So that's what I was looking into. And then, so at age 22, I was just like, whoa, okay, wow, yeah, no, this makes sense. This sounds right. This seems like what's going on with me, especially because I was looking into the, end quote, female traits of autism. Even though I'm non-binary, I was socialized as a girl, so, that kind of stuff. And then it took me about 6 years to get a formal diagnosis because everyone kept telling me that my eye contact was too good. I was, hyperlexic. I was too socially adept, all of these things. So they kept just saying, no, I don't think it's autism, and wouldn't even refer me for assessments. And so it wasn't until I was 28 and working in a comic book shop and talking about autism all the time because it was my special interest that I found some customer who was also autistic. And then that customer said, I have a good friend who assesses adults for autism. And I was like, oh my God, what? Tell me more, right? And so finally I got to see someone who was female herself, was not American, originally German, and was a PhD specialist in autism, who I'm pretty sure is on the spectrum herself. And we just had one conversation, and she was like, yep, sounds like autism. And so I just had her write me an official diagnosis letter in 2018 at age 28. And then I had my big autistic burnout and have been trying to recover ever since by learning as much as I can about autism, neurodivergence, developmental neuroscience, and trauma, all of these things.
So it's interesting, 2012, there was a lot less understanding about the autistic experience then. Even today,
Yeah.
if someone's mentioned, like, oh, I think you have autistic traits or you might be autistic, they may be not so open to that information. Why were you so open to that at that point in time?
For me personally, I had always felt different. Like, always. From a very, very young age, I just knew there was something different about me. And I can't tell you how I knew that, except for little things that would happen at school. And I mean, in some ways, you could say this isn't a little thing, but I do remember when I was in like kindergarten or something, a girl on the playground came up to me, and I had just transferred, like I was new. So she didn't know me. She had no reason to dislike me per se, but she just came straight up to me and said, I don't like you. And I said, what did I do? I literally haven't done anything. And then she just went, I don't know. I just don't like you. And then from that point on, her and the other kids avoided me. And that happened many times to me in my school career. And no one would ever tell me why, like what I did. And I don't think I did anything. I think I just was different and they could tell, like neuroception, just like some sort of pack mentality. I was just not a part of the pack. And every time I tried to pretend, right, to mask, I tried so hard to just like zip my lips, shut my mouth so I didn't speak, so no one could tell anything about who I was. And then I would just stand near other kids and for as long as they allowed me to be there, right? And then I would observe them. And I remember thinking, God, these people are boring. Like they're talking about nothing. They're either talking about things that are completely so mundane and so irrelevant to me, right? Like I want to talk about abstract concepts and systems and like, really cool, deep stuff. And they're just like talking about what they saw on Pokemon, but not even in a fun, cool, deep dive way, And so I was just like, I can't even relate to these kids. Or they were talking about stuff that I didn't understand because there was some sort of weird social stuff happening that no one was explaining to me because they thought I should just know it. So I just always felt like I was an outsider. Even when the other kids invited me to things or allowed me to be around them, there was just something that kept me apart. So I started to actually look into abnormal psychology for funsies when I was 12. And that explained a lot, but it did not explain enough, right? It basically just told me about trauma. It told me about why I was feeling pain, why there was suffering, that kind of stuff. But it didn't explain anything to do with neurodivergence or neurodiversity. So once I had something new, some explanation that was outside of the scope of everything I already understood, I was like, missing piece. This must be it. And it was.
You were working on a degree in biopsychology, cognition, and neuroscience, but have taken a pause on that. So, would you like to share about what happened and what are your plans now in regards to your academic aspirations?
Yeah, that's it's a great question. It's a tough question in the sense that I have a lot of strong feelings about all of that. I've tried to go to college or university like 5 or 6 times now, like different colleges and universities, right? And this most recent time, I tried to do it right, meaning all the financial aid, all of the disability support services, all of the resources that I could get to support students who are struggling. And I made it one quarter. I aced that quarter. I was vice president of the neurodiversity club. I did well. And then the next quarter, I couldn't. I had overextended myself and I'd gone into burnout again. So even with all of the resources, it still wasn't enough. And when I had chosen to go back to school again, some friends of the family, because my family are largely academics and educators as well as like artists and creative types, but some family friends who are like psychology teachers, they basically said that my current knowledge base is really far beyond what is even being taught in academia. So I might not really benefit that much from it. And what I did discover is what's happening is that I was very far beyond where I wanted my professors and teachers to be in terms of their knowledge base on especially neuroscience. And so there was all of these factors at play, and I kept asking for more supports and trying to self-advocate and educate people in this very liberal, progressive, wealthy part of the country. You'd think Washington State, of all places, would be able to accommodate someone like me, but nope, they couldn't. And so I had to drop out again. I did a medical withdrawal, and then they ended up hiring me to educate the faculty and staff on how to be more neuro-inclusive. So it's like, at this point, I think I'm probably just going to be writing my own materials and then selling them to academia later, because it just seems like what I'm doing is really far beyond what everyone else is doing. And I think I know why, but it just makes things really complicated for me to be aligned with academia right now.
What was their response once you kind of shared materials with them and kind of were educating the educators?
Yeah, yeah. I get a lot of wows. I get a lot of like, oh, that's so interesting. Like, wow, I never would have thought about it that way. That kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things in the world is to help people experience what it's like to shift perspectives or paradigms and step out of their previous way of seeing things into a new way. That is one of like, I don't know, it makes me feel like what I'm doing is worthwhile. So when I hear that in other people, when they're genuinely like, whoa, yeah, what you're saying is a totally different way of looking at things, like that's where I start to feel like, okay, we're getting somewhere finally. So I do appreciate that, but I'm waiting for those educators who are really hungry for this, I'm waiting for those who are like, not just like, this is an interesting intellectual theoretical exercise. I like, no, I want people who are ready to sink their teeth in, who are ready to do research, who are ready to like build models and systems based on this stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So many of us as autistic people have co-occurring conditions, and you were recently discussing on your social media the how and why these occur for so many of us. What would it be important for people to know about kind of the development of so many of these co-occurring conditions?
This is one of my favorite topics. Talk about special interest, it's not just autism and neuroscience, it's like the intersection that's like my favorite thing, right? So one of the things that I talk a lot about is how developmental disability even forms, how chronic illness even forms, and behavioral challenges, everything like this. It all comes down to stress on the nervous system, especially the developing nervous system, right? So while people have a funny idea about like us being born in certain ways, already fully developed in certain respects, like even on a neurotype level, right? Yes, there are like genetic predispositions for developing or being born with a sort of core nervous structure. However, we have until age like 25 to 30 that our brain and nervous system is developing the core, structure of it. So there is a lot of room for change. And what ends up happening is if we have a nervous system structure, brain structure, neurotype, as some call it, that is what is being called divergent. And I'm putting it in quotations because that term only means something in the context of the bell curve and the arbitrary established what is considered normal to have something diverging, right? And it's important. I'll talk about that in a second as to why that's so important that we talk about like the literal meaning of the terms, because it starts to break down depending on the sphere of influence we're talking about. So in the actual like neuroscience, like conception, which I fully understand, the term neurodivergent was originally a social justice term, not a neuroscience term. However, it does have a nervous or neuroscience corollary, right? It is referring to something that's happening, neurologically speaking. So if we're going to talk about just on the nervous system level, then we have this neurotype, let's say the autistic neurotype. And the autistic neurotype is extra sensitive. It is more complex in the sense that there's more neural connections, more activity happening often, fewer prunings. And so what that means is that there is way more likelihood of developing a trauma response to something because of the highly sensitive and specialized nature of that nervous system. It's kind of like when you have an orchid, right? Like a very specialized flower that needs really specific conditions. If you take it outside of the conditions that it needs to thrive, it barely will survive. And that's largely what like autistic and neurodivergent people are. The trauma or co-occurring conditions that we develop, and I would even say the symptoms that are being listed as autistic traits in the DSM are not intrinsic autistic traits. Those are actually symptoms of co-occurring trauma disorders, developmental trauma disorders. And that's something I'm pushing against when it comes to the DSM as a whole, I think it's literally just a manual of what happens when you have trauma. But I don't think that's helpful when it comes to neurodivergence, because I think that what is being called neurodivergent conditions like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc., are a conflation of the intrinsic divergent neurotype that's extra sensitive or extra specialized, plus the pretty much unavoidable trauma that we have to go through and experience by being so specialized and unique in this type of world. So I think that it's largely, and we hear conversations about this all the time, where it's only the severely traumatized of us who end up getting the diagnosis, because that is what the criteria in the DSM is a lot of the time. So people who are autistic but maybe don't have meltdowns and shutdowns, maybe don't have selective mutism, don't have a lot of these co-occurring conditions that are not intrinsic to autism but commonly co-occurring, right? And that's huge, because one of the pushback things that I hear the most is like, well, you're just only mild, right? You only have mild autism. Well, what about these people who have severe autism or profound autism? And I'm like, no. We're all just autistic. That's co-occurring conditions, right? So for me, I talk a lot about the specifics of the how to identify what the original trauma wound is, and then how to heal that wound. No matter how old you are, no matter when you got that wound, it is possible to heal. And then when we do this work, it's funny because a lot of the time people will say we seem less neurodivergent, but that's just because they've associated neurodivergence with trauma.
Now, lived experience is so important to me. And whenever I'm researching anyone to interview, if they talk about their lived experience in any way, I want to learn more about it. And on your LinkedIn page in the About section, you wrote that all about your identities, that you're a disabled, autistic, transmasc, non-binary, Catalan, Cuban, Latinx, lived experience educator. That sounds like a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, I know.
But I
It's a
think,
mouthful.
but we all have a lot of. So many of us have so many different identities that play into our lived experience. So I'm curious, with all of your different identities, how do you think they connect or change your autistic experience?
I kind of would say it's almost the other way around, that the autism ends up causing each of those other identities to have this unique twist to them, because I've noticed that even in like the Latin world, I'm weird. Even in the non-binary world, I'm weird. Even in the whatever world, I'm weird. Or it's like I'm always a minority in every single community that I'm in. And I think it has maybe something to do with the fact that so many of my identities exist in this marginalized state. So it's kind of like I'm used to being the odd man out. I'm used to being the one who has the smallest voice. So I'm used to having to stand on my own. And I think that there's this interesting combination of factors that influence my personality. Well, you can even say personalities, because one of my identities is plural, but that's something that I'm still working to explore, because there's a lot of stigma about dissociative identity disorders and stuff. So for now, that one I don't necessarily reveal or talk about a lot publicly, but I would say that being autistic helps me challenge the norms in every group. And I think that is a gift for me, because so much of, Latin culture, for instance, like a lot of collectivist cultures, like we were talking about earlier, there's like this immense social pressure for respecting tradition, for honoring your elders, for conformity, for uniformity, for all of these things, And I, could never fall in line. I could never be like everyone else. And on one hand, I would say I was fortunate because I come from two lines of neurospicy weirdos who just completely have done their own things forever. So I had a lot of modeling, a lot of role models that it is okay to carve your own path no matter like where you are. But I think that because of being autistic and so non-conforming in every way, that has almost in some ways undermined my other identities because I don't express or exhibit traits that are more commonly associated with those identities and cultures, right? And I often get a bad reputation of like of being rude, right? Because I don't care to follow certain practices and norms when I don't agree with them, you know? So, if anything, I would say like the autism has been this like cornerstone for everything else to be tied to, you know? Because it's like, no matter if I were Latin or some other ethnicity, no matter if I were, you know, some other gender or whatever, the autism would still be like this central component that's influencing my entire perception and interpretation of reality, you know?
So, from what I understand, you're using your lived experience as a neurodivergent peer support service coordinator. What are some
Yeah.
important things that you think someone needs to bring to a role like this if they're to be helpful to those that they're supporting?
Well, that ties perfectly into the previous question because I think the number one element of my lived experience, and I like to say this lifetime because I don't know if I've had other lifetimes, you know, but all I remember is this lifetime, so I can only speak about this one. And this lifetime, my lived experience is all about the feeling of being othered, of being separated from everyone, of being isolated, even inside of myself, like stuck in my own head, right? And like the nervous shutdown and collapse and like the inner paralysis, all of that kind of stuff. And I've seen how the more marginalized a person is, so you know, when you're an intersectional minority and have like multiple elements of marginalization occurring, it's just like it just compounds, like the trauma, the wounds. It's like more and more weight, and then you just get like bogged down, and then you're just like stuck, right? And I've realized, being in therapy since I was really, really young, seeing all of these professionals, you know, all of these support people, the providers, the experts, largely they've all been white. Largely they've all been really privileged. Largely they've all been neurotypical. And none of them really understood what I was going through and how to support me, how to reach me, how to help me feel like any of it made sense. I think that peer support from others with lived experience that matched my own has been the number one most helpful thing, way more so than any clinical formal medical supports I've ever received. I mean, just having another autistic person be like, yeah, guess what? That's called psychoneuroimmunology. And it's about like the interaction of the nervous system with, you know, psychology and all these other factors. And this is what, and I'm like, I'm sorry, what now? Why did none of my providers tell me these things, you know? Why is it that we have to figure it out for ourselves and then go educate our providers? I have to tell my doctors what autism is and how it impacts me all the time. It's ridiculous, you know? And so right now I'm actively trying to kind of elbow my way up into the Washington State Healthcare Authority and be like, look, we really need to assess what we're doing here when it comes to healthcare, because we are making things worse instead of better when it comes to the neurodivergent populations.
As a support service coordinator, you help coordinate services for neurominorities who aren't getting the help they need from the government or local communities. I know there are a lot, but what do you see are some of the the biggest barriers in service coordination?
Oh gosh, yeah. So the way that I look at the support service industry, even though it shouldn't be an industry, it's like they're doing things in a very confusing and disorganized way with zero centralization and zero communication and coordination between agencies and branches. So, what I have proposed to the Healthcare Authority and some others here locally in Whatcom County is to get a neurodivergent community center going, because then we could have this one stop place where someone can walk in off the street downtown and be like, hey, I'm neurodivergent, I need help. And then I can be like, cool, let's go in the back. I'll, you know, let's sit down, let's chat for a bit, and I'll help you figure out what it is that you need and how to get you connected with the people who can help you get that. because it's really just so many neurodivergent people are in mega overwhelm, burnout, shutdown, executive dysfunction, just like not functional. Like literally cognitive functions up here, not working. Like we were just so overloaded, right? So we really need someone to almost like hold our hand step by step in the beginning when it comes to getting connected if we were in a really bad place. And there's tons of, unhoused people, the drug abuse, situations, the overdoses and suicides here, especially in Whatcom, it's like really bad. And it's a nice place full of like old, rich, white, with retired people. So it's like, what's happening? It's this systemic discrimination issue, right? Where we are not getting the support that we need. And sometimes that support is something that people really don't get, where it could just be co-working or body doubling, right? Like literally just having a person there while we do something, or having somebody make the phone call for us. But there's like so many legal restrictions and financial restrictions for getting direct support professionals. And so I've got a caregiver, and this is something I've been trying to work towards as well, is like there is the number two, like two things, okay? If I'm going to summarize it right now, two things I'm working on. Number one, removing the legislative red tape, the eligibility criteria. So people are not able to get Social Security or Developmental Disability Association funding or services because of the eligibility barriers. And then the second one is the income restriction and asset restriction for disabled people. Because then, even if you are receiving Social Security or developmental disability services, you cannot also be self-employed or a working professional at all and make a certain amount of money, or you start to lose your benefits. If you get married, you can lose your benefits. Like there's so many ways that you can lose your benefits. So to me, those are the two first most important things I'm working on addressing on the legislative sphere. And then on the community sphere, a lot of it is literally just basic needs. And so that I'm trying to get that funding and the services, the eligibility, because it's like Maslow's basic level. Housing, food, shelter, not stressing over like if you're going to pay your bills, being able to like not work yourself to death because you're literally chronically ill and needing some time to recover. A lot of neurodivergent people just need to take some time off to not work, right? Because they're in burnout and they need to just recover full time. But if they don't have the support, if they don't have the money, if no one's willing to pay for that, right? What are we going to do? So that's why I'm like, we need a community center to support that. And then eventually long-term goal is I want to create intentional communities and eco-villages that are designed to support people full-time recovering from burnout. And they don't have to work. It's post-currency. There's volunteers. And just like whenever they feel ready, then they can start contributing again.
The eligibility criteria is always so interesting or stupid to me because here in Ohio, it's 22. You have to have a formal diagnosis prior to the age of 22, which has never made sense from the autistic experience because
Right.
so many of us are learn about our autism after the age of 22, but of course we were clearly autistic way before then, so it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
It's the same thing here. I'm actually surprised to hear that it's 22 because here it's age 18. And they also said if you got your ASD diagnosis after the age of 18, you have to show medical evidence prior to the age of 5 of autistic traits. And it's like, do you know what level of ableist, privileged crap that is? Like, come on.
Absolutely, and I think one of the other things is like you saying in Washington it's 18 and in Ohio it's 22. If we talk to someone, I'm just making this up, in Illinois or in Florida or in California or Texas, we'll get all different types of answers.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Ah, America.
Yes, so much that needs to be done still. So much support, service, coordination, where it doesn't seem like it's interesting. The word coordination is a part of the jargon because it seems like it's so discoordinated.
I think that is kind of okay. If I'm gonna, since we're autistic, I'll speak as frankly and bluntly as I like, right? Because that's one of those things, depending on who we're talking to, you got to be careful with what you're saying. I don't think that it is any surprise if I were to say that my personal beliefs about the US system, the government system, the sociopolitical system, is that it's not broken, it's fixed. You know what I mean? It's rigged, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, when I think about the coordination, the care coordination, right? I think about the lack of coordination happening intentionally on some level. Because it's like, think about how much money the USA has. They could choose to allot some of that money for coordination, for communication systems, for technology that's reviewing stuff, but they don't. Why is that? Because they don't care that things are getting lost and people are falling through the cracks. They don't care. So I'm like, if they're not going to care, someone has to. And that's why I'm like, look, I don't care that you don't care. I don't care that you think that you're untouchable and that you're in this government political position of power. I'm going to keep barking at your door until you pay attention. Because, like, this is important. People are dying. Like, no.
And if our listeners want to learn more about you and bark at your door, how can they go about doing so beyond this interview?
Love it. Please do. Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find online. Speaking of not very coordinated, even though I'm easy to find online, everything is very scattered. So I'm still in the process of kind of organizing things because myself, I also need executive function support in order to get my stuff, online. And so hit me up via email, find any of my social media accounts, just like Jax Bayne is my name on most things. And you can pretty much DM me almost anywhere and just like say who you are and what you want to talk about, and you're good. I'm happy to talk to you because this is what I love talking about.
Wonderful. And I was very happy to talk with you today, Jax. Thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much to Jax for the conversation. To learn more about Jax, please check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode on how does having intersectional identities impact your autistic experience. Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to lead self-directed, purpose-driven lives through our customized life coaching and community groups. Our distinct approach prioritizes each client's unique goals and preferences, fostering a sense of agency and promoting self-advocacy. Coaches work collaboratively with clients to develop personalized strategies and tools that can help with executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationship building, stress management, and more. We also support parents and partners of autistic individuals by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. With our accessible remote services, individuals from any location can receive the assistance and mentoring they need. So please join us today to experience judgment-free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.